the London Jesuit Centre. My name is John Moffatt, and this is our podcast series for teachers to help you think around some of the big philosophical and theological ideas that come up in November, the month of the dead, and December, the month of Advent and Christmas. This is a November episode, and in it we'll be looking at death and afterlife, things which have been of existential concern to human beings from time immemorial. In the process, I want to focus on the idea of a soul, not just because that idea in its different versions is central to any story of death and the afterlife, but because the way we think about our own soul or self also gives us a template for imagining that greater self we call God. We'll begin with a scene which is very common in Catholic Central Europe on the afternoon of 1st of November, the Feast of All Saints. If you walk by a graveyard in the evening, you will see hundreds of small candles burning by the graves. People have visited the gravesides of their loved ones and left this sign of hope, of their enduring connection with the people whose mortal remains lie beneath the headstone. The next day, on November the 2nd, Masses are said specially for the repose of the souls of the dead. Catholic Christians think of them as being in an in-between state, which they label purgatory, a time of purification by fire, a time in which they still need prayers and support. Most churches throughout the Catholic world will keep a November list, where churchgoers write down the names of family members and others whom they would like remembered and brought into the saving action of the Masses throughout the month. This sort of practice is rejected by the Lutheran and Reformed traditions because in the Gospel, Jesus does not seem to talk about any such in-between time. He talks freely about heaven and hell after death, but he doesn't seem to mention anything like Catholic purgatory, even though some Jews of his time clearly did believe in something of that kind. Most Christians in those traditions do not believe that there is anything we can usefully do for the dead. Nevertheless, the practice clearly has a power to it, because it taps into something that is much, much older than Christianity, a very human concern for the world of the dead, and a living connection with those who have gone before. It seems to be something that marks us off as humans from other animals. Here are some of the reasons for thinking that. As Christian missionaries tried to explain their faith to the Chinese peoples in the 16th century and to African peoples in the 19th century, they found that they had to find some way of respecting the fundamental importance of the relationship and the reverence due to the ancestors. The same concern appears in the literature, architecture, and practices of the ancient world. Romans, Greeks, Anglo-Saxons, Assyrians, Celts, Egyptians, all bury their dead with ceremony and treat the places of burial with a sort of holy respect, often with formal rituals attached. A few years ago, at the cradle of humankind in South Africa, they discovered a large collection of hominin bones in a deep cave, dating to about 200,000 years ago. The anthropologists, trying to make sense of this find from the Rising Star cave, concluded that even though these were not directly our human ancestors, this might be early evidence of hominins like us burying their dead. We are self-aware animals, able to stand back and look at what is happening to us, to think about why it is happening, and occasionally to do something about it. Losing people we love, family and friends, is an inescapable and painful part of being human. And at some point, all of us, however happy and successful our lives, have to face the fact that our life on this planet comes to an end. Our burial practices, our respect for the remains of the dead, our longing for a continuing relationship with them seems importantly connected with the fact that we are thinking, feeling, self-aware beings for whom communication and relationships matter. Being alive, being aware, being there with other people in the world. All of that matters, and we do not want to lose it. Me, myself, my memories, my story, all that bundles into the idea of a self, a soul, that can in some way continue when this physical body ceases to function. This finite self has yearnings, fears, fantasies that affect us physically. It has dazzling and painful sensory experiences and intuitions that reach beyond the boundaries of life of this world. And it is a puzzle, seeing how it fits in with the rest of the world of plants, trees, insects and elephants, rocks, oceans and stars. Our first attempts to explain the puzzle of these selves and their mysterious sense of other selves beyond the world of mortals are captured in storytelling, in myths, and eventually articulated in the more analytic or scientific language which we call philosophy, theology, psychology, anthropology. This raw material of Christian thought, the fundamental ideas for thinking about a creator God, about humanity and its destiny, about the person of Christ, is already there in the ancient traditions of the world that shaped Christianity. It's there in the Old Testament, and it's there in the wider traditions of the Greek-speaking world. Christianity inherits the Old Testament with its distinctive theology of a supreme creator God whose powerful word runs through the world and shapes it. But it is also a child of a later stage of Judaism, which is at home in the Greek-speaking world, saturated with the different streams of Greek thought and with philosophers' attempts to make coherent sense of the world, sacred and profane. Those ancient Christians and non-Christians created the language in which modern Christians express their faith. But they were asking questions that have not gone away. How do we make sense of the self we experience? How do we give an account of the human soul with its desires, its failings, its powers of reason and purpose? Is it the kind of thing that can live on without a physical body when this mortal body dies? Imagine yourself in free fall, with no tug of gravity to hold you, no force to resist your motion and make you feel your weight. Imagine a complete absence of light. There is nothing to see, and of sound. There is nothing to hear. There is nothing to taste or smell, and your limbs float free, touching nothing. Still, you would have awareness of yourself as a self-aware entity, continuous in time, in this sensory void. That is a thought experiment of the great 11th century Islamic philosopher Avicenna, which in part aims to show how you can be a human self without needing a body. This gives us the simplest way of thinking about how life after death is possible. A self or soul is not a material body itself, but it is able to interact with material bodies and direct them. However, because it is a fundamentally different sort of thing, a soul can exist on its own without a body. Avicenna didn't invent this idea, though it seems he did invent the thought experiment. He inherited it via the tradition of the philosopher Plato. Plato, who lived 400 years before the time of Jesus, argued that human souls were non-material and immortal, and that they could be reincarnated in different bodies. We can recognize the similarities with Hindu and Buddhist beliefs here. And it may well be that one of the philosophical traditions Plato inherited had been influenced by ideas from India. We can see quite a contrast with older, more mythical pictures of what happens to souls after death. When we look at Odysseus' journey to the underworld in Homer's Odyssey, the souls of the dead are recognizable, but they are like faded holograms or echoes of the body of the living person, and their life in the underworld is only a shadow of their life in this world. Even for those who are doing quite nicely in the underworld, living in the fields of the blessed, they'd much prefer to be up here in the sunshine of the real world. The shade of the hero Achilles tells Odysseus, "I'd rather be working the soil as a bonded labourer in a nameless village than lord of all the dead." In the more ancient writings of the Old Testament, we see something similar. In several of the Psalms, the dead are said to be cut off from the community of worshippers. The dead cannot praise you, only the living can praise you. And when King Saul summons the spirit of the prophet Samuel, the shade of Samuel asks him why he has disturbed his sleep. But for Plato, it is the other way round. This soul is the most real part of the person, and separation from the body is an opportunity to make a journey away from a world of bodies which change and decay, and to draw closer to a world of superreality, of goodness and light. Plato's way of thinking about the soul has been very influential in Christian, Jewish, and Islamic thought, especially as a way of thinking about prayer or meditation as a deliberate escape from the distractions of the bodily world, so that the soul can draw close to eternally changeless goodness, truth, and beauty. If you follow Plato's logic to its conclusion, ultimate happiness doesn't seem to need a body at all, though his souls always seem to end up reincarnated. As in Hinduism, how they have behaved in one life affects the sort of body they are given in the next one. But unlike Hinduism and Buddhism, Plato doesn't seem to have the idea of a final definitive release, an attainment of ultimate eternal happiness in which we finally escape the cycle of birth and rebirth in moksha, liberation, or nirvana. However, this wasn't the only way of thinking about the soul or self that Christianity inherited. There were other philosophers who were more interested than Plato in the physical world, a world of animate and inanimate bodies. Plato's student Aristotle, who was a biologist, saw the soul as a sort of living force which gave shape to inert matter and made it dynamic. A plant's soul shaped the plant's matter and made it grow. An animal's soul made the animal's matter able to see and hear and get up and move around. In his language, he talked about the soul being the form of the plant or animal body. That sort of soul is clearly mortal. When the animal becomes a dead body, it is precisely because that soul is no longer there. But Aristotle, like Plato, seems to have thought that in human animals there is a higher part of our soul, the part of us that can use reason, delight in knowing things, appreciate value and truth. This part can separate from our animal soul on death and exist in a higher, disembodied realm. Everyone knew that there was a close physical connection between the higher part of our soul, which has awareness and reason, and our bodies, through which we experience the world and move about in it. But how did it work? One group of philosophers who were very influential at the time of Jesus suggested that the higher part of our soul was just as physical as every other part. Souls were made of the divine, dynamic elements of wind and fire. Individual souls shared in these elements, which carried the divine spirit or word. That word gave shape to the inert elements of earth and water, giving them life and making earthly bodies move. For these Stoic philosophers, our souls are both physical and conscious things. When they leave a mortal body in death, they can return to the fiery realm. When a great hero dies, a new star appears burning in the sky. And that's an image we can find capturing the imagination in some of the later Jewish writings about the afterlife, like the Book of Daniel and the Book of Wisdom. Theories of the self, like those of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, allowed Jewish thinkers to reimagine the relationship between the living self, the world, and God. We'll see some of how that works itself out in the next episode.